Hello, everyone, and welcome to Code 201 using the Breaking the Code Toolkit. This is put on by WYOPASS, and our guest trainers today, or presenters, are Tymczyszyn from Community Builders and Jamin Kimmel from Cascadia Partners.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. If you didn't make it to last month's webinar, what we're talking about today is code reform and code audit to make your housing more affordable, to enable more affordable housing or attainable housing in your communities. A lot of today's talk and this project in general came out of kind of a series of projects that have been happening over the years. Back in 2018, the organization that I work with, Community Builders, did a training on affordable housing up in Lander, Wyoming, and we had a team or a group of different teams of communities come from across Wyoming, from Lander and Level and Laramie and kind of all over to converge and spend a couple of days talking about housing affordability. And one of the things we learned is that kind of no matter how big or how small your community is, so many communities in the room had issues with their code where, they might have a great housing section in their comp plan or a great housing action plan or housing strategy, but the stuff that they're wanting to build and want to see get built in their community was impossible to build because they had some issues with their code that wasn't allowing it to happen. So we partnered with some folks with WYOPASS and with the Wyoming Business Council, and then of course with our friends over at Cascadia Partners to essentially make a tool to help communities dive into their code and dig into their code and understand it a little bit better, and start playing with it to get a little bit more familiar and look under the hood at their code and start figuring out how to be able to do an audit of their code to see what the issues are and what the barriers are. So last month we talked a little bit about what some of those big red flags are, some of the things the issues that we see in code are kind of across the state of Wyoming. And then today, of course, is kind of a little bit of a deeper dive on how to really dig into your code yourself and to do a kind of a do-it-yourself code audit. And some of this will be based on the tool that we built in partnership with Cascadia. So Jamin is our kind of our code expert. He's our guru for all of this. So I'll just hand it over to you, Jamin, and you can take it away.
All right, that sounds great. Thanks, Bud. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and get us kicked off here. All right. So as Bud mentioned, this is the second in the series here, looking at giving you some tools and some best practices and different approaches for conducting a code audit and really focusing on housing issues and housing affordability. So I'm going to cover, going to be kind of using two different slide presentations here today, but a lot of what I wanted to do with this training is to actually demo the code audit tool itself that we've put together. I thought that would be what would be most useful for this group, so you can get to start to feel for how the code audit tool works and how you might apply it to kind of a code audit process in your own community. So want to leave plenty of time for everyone to pause at a couple points for questions and kind of make sure you're tracking along. It gets a little bit technical. We've tried to simplify this as much as possible because we kind of tried to design the tool around something that both a trained planner could use, as well as someone in the community. But for the most part, it's still tricky stuff. So plenty of time for everyone to ask questions. The first thing I want to just kind of give you a big picture overview of kind of what the code audit process looks like. And this slide deck does a good job of this. And so we thought we'd step through this. So this is put together by Community Builders. And as Bud mentioned, they've been doing some work getting together teams and people from a few different communities across Wyoming and other places we've been doing work and dealing with this challenge of our plans and our vision for our community looks like something like this. First graphic, right? We have our old Main Street, which we want to continue to have that kind of charming storefront environment. We have core neighborhoods that have a variety of different housing types that are available to build. But then when we actually get down to what our code allows, we're not getting that form of development, right? So we talked a lot about that at the last session of all the different code standards that can get in the way of what your vision and your plan calls for, and the ways it can be inconsistent with your vision. But how do you identify which of those standards in your community is getting in the way, and which is getting in the way the most, is probably the better way to put it, of what standards are driving up either the cost of development or preventing development on your existing infill lots, and kind of can we get a sense of how important each of those standards are in terms of acting as a barrier to the kind of development you want. And so we put together the Breaking the Code guidebook, which the Code 201 or the 101 session was really intended to cover that, to give you a sense of what the common issues that we see and kind of give you some starting places to start thinking about what standards might be a challenge for development and what are some common issues we see. But kind of accompanying that, we wanted to put together this tool, which would be kind of a simplified version of a real estate pro forma model that we have used often to try to model the physical and kind of financial impacts of code changes. And so it's called a code audit tool, but at its kind of root, it really is a real estate financial pro forma spreadsheet. It is a tool that if you were a developer looking to build something in your community, they might go through some kind of process like this to kind of test out what might be feasible and what is not. And this is just basically a spreadsheet that's kind of tailored to trying to understand the impact specifically of code changes.
I'll mention too that this tool is really something that Jamin and Cascadia partners. It's kind of what they use if you were to call them and say, "Hey, can you do a code audit for us? Something's happening with our code. Or there's something going on with our development where we're getting this weird pattern, and we know there's something wrong. Can you figure it out for us?" This is kind of the backbone of the process that Jamin and his crew over at Cascadia Partners uses when they do this stuff for hire. And so it was really, really cool of them to kind of help open source this and make this available for anyone to use. That's what really this stuff is based on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, our philosophy with all this is that we want to be able to show the community which of the barriers are getting in the way and really quantify those impacts. So that's why we use these pro forma tools, because as much as when we can tell by looking at a code and kind of from our professional judgment and understanding best practices and our experience, we can tell when a standard might be a challenge. But showing the community that is a whole different kind of challenge. And so quantifying the impact of it on the cost of housing or on the financial feasibility of development is a way that we just take it a step further to not just kind of try to tell communities, hey, this parking standard might be getting in the way of some kinds of development you might want to see, but show them with numbers and hopefully also some images or graphics. So we'll dig into this tool today. It's entirely free and open source, like Bud mentioned. I'm actually not sure. So, but if you could chime in of where it's hosted right now and how the everyone on the call could get access to it.
Sure. It's on our website. I'll pop a link in the chat box here.
Great. So yeah, available online, download it. It's an Excel spreadsheet. So it'll feel very familiar to you. It's a spreadsheet with a lot of kind of fancy formulas and macros kind of running inside of it. But nothing that you need to have a kind of masterclass in Excel to be able to work with. And it's pretty straightforward for the most part. So let me give you a sense of kind of what the DIY code audit process might look like for you. And this will just kind of go from beginning to end first, and so you can kind of get a sense for the big picture. And then I'll kind of step through a more step-by-step example from a community in Wyoming, which I picked out and did a little code testing on. And so we'll go into more depth in each of these steps, but this is just a chance to kind of like conceptually get your head around kind of where we're headed. And so first thing is kind of just picking a kind of test project. So, there's a lot of different ways you can kind of set out the scope of your code audit. You might be focused on a particular neighborhood or a particular zone. You might be interested in a particular housing type. So for example, maybe we want to try to understand why townhomes are not being built in our community. And we might look at that housing type across multiple zones. We might look at it in one zone. But hopefully this is rooted in a community process where you've talked about what kind of housing, infill housing or housing in general, do you want to see more of, and that we're not getting right now. And so kind of think about what the scope is that makes sense for your community, and it varies based on the community and what your goals are. It's probably a good idea to keep your scope somewhat focused if you're just kind of taking this on as a first project and cracking open the code, and think about this in incrementally. So maybe we know there's a zone that would be a great location for more housing development. Maybe it's a common focus is the kind of residential zone that's close to your downtown. Maybe you have some historic parts of town. There might be some redevelopment opportunities there. There might be some vacant infill lots. So kind of just think about the scope and what your community's goals are. And then we'll get into this more in the code audit, but we tend to focus on infill development when we are doing a code audit. And the reason for that is that most codes don't present as many barriers to kind of greenfield development on the edge of the city. And so if you have a lot of land to work with, you have a big site, the code is not going to present as many barriers. It can still certainly increase the cost of housing unnecessarily and increase the cost of development. But starting with an infill lot and thinking about, does our code allow this for infill, the kind of housing we want, is kind of a surefire way to make sure that it also works for greenfield development. And so if you can make that project or that housing type work on your standard infill lot, which is usually a smaller lot than are available kind of on the edges of town, then it's certainly going to work in the greenfield situation. So it's kind of like solve for the infill lots, and greenfield kind of takes care of itself. And so we think we start to then go through code our process and ask, can we put that housing type we want on that lot? So let's say a fourplex is, kind of a missing middle housing type. We want that infill in some single family neighborhoods to get a more variety of housing types across our city. And so we start to test the code, and a lot of times we find that the things like density and minimum lot size requirements are a huge barrier. For example, yes, you can build a fourplex or a sixplex, but you have to have something like 30,000 square feet, and that's 5 of our standard lots. And so there's not many lots that size that are just available, and so you'd have to assemble multiple lots, and that's a huge barrier. And so these are the kind of things you start to find. Well, then if we assume, okay, if we remove the density standards, that doesn't allow a fourplex or a sixplex to be built on that standard lot, then what could be built? And then so we start to model that and look at what other standards might be getting in the way. So in here, there's a large front on this example, there's a large front setback, which really prohibits the parking from being put in the back. So you have a lot of parking in the front, which doesn't look great. And it also kind of limits the overall amount of the site where you can put the building. So we layer on, okay, here's where the building can go. It fits physically, but it's pretty ugly, and I don't know if you'd really see somebody build that. Maybe you would, but let's test and see if we made some changes, what that would look like. And so, assuming that we're going for a fourplex, and we can also then calculate what the rent and sales price would be for those units. So to get a sense for kind of a baseline of what rents are needed to be able to make that project feasible. And then we test some changes. So if we were to go say, okay, well, what if we reduce the parking standards from 2 spaces per unit to 1.5 spaces per unit? What if we reduce that front setback to allow and make it easier to put the parking in the back? And let's say there's alleys, and so that makes a lot of sense because you can then have rear access parking. Not only does that building look better in that case, and physically it makes a lot more sense. And then we can start to think about, well, what if we were to allow a little bit more density? And so remove some of the density standards, maybe reduce parking additionally further, maybe in this case, you're allowing up to a sixplex, and that allows you to get your rents and your potential sale prices down even further because you're having more units on the same size lot. And so that's kind of the quick big picture version of what a code audit might look like. Is kind of that's where we're kind of headed. And so let's do kind of the step by step now. Bud, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's about it. Yeah.
All right. So this step-by-step guidebook is part of the documents that were put together with the best practices guides that we did. And so this is really intended to kind of live side by side with the code audit tool, so you can refer back to this as you're working with the tool, and have some of your questions answered and kind of take a step-by-step process through this. So I'm going to use this a little bit, but I'll also be spending a lot of time in the tool just kind of showing you how this works. So talk with that. So here's the kind of steps in kind of in a more detailed fashion going through code audit kind of methodology. So I'm first going to talk about these first few steps here around the zoning research matrix, and that is kind of the phase in the code audit where you're gathering all the information you need to be able to actually build a model of what can be built under your existing zoning. And then we'll talk about some of the pro forma tool itself and how to create a model based on your existing code standards, how to make sure it's compliant with the code so you can get a baseline example, which you can then compare your code changes against. And then we'll talk about different ways to structure code changes, testing code changes and showing the results and the impacts of code changes. So the zoning research matrix is, just basically the first tab in the code audit tool. And so let me open it up and just kind of give you a sense of what it looks like. So this is the kind of first page that you land on when you open up the tool in the first tab. It's called Quick Start Guide. And has a little bit of background information here. This step 2, where we're selecting our user type, we'll get to that in a moment. But I've just, for now, I'll do ROI Light, I call it, or it's called in here. And let's go to this first tab, which is the zone matrix. And so the purpose of this tab is to simply just to gather all of the zoning standards which are function as inputs to this pro forma model. And so these are all the key standards that really affect what can be built in a zone and what it looks like. And so this is already pre-filled with some standards here, and so these aren't accurate for what we are going to, the zone and the city we're going to look at. But the point of this is really to put this all in one place so that you're not kind of going back and forth to opening up your zoning code, looking for what was that standard in that zone, and trying to kind of dig through multiple pages, to get back to that information that you need. So, really the idea here is collect this all in this first tab so you always have it on hand and it's easy to get to. And then when we get to the point where we're modeling the building, the future tabs in this spreadsheet will refer back to the information that's in these cells, and it will alert you if you are modeling something that's not in compliance with the code standards that are in this table. And so it's also important to get this correct so that you can use it to kind of flag when you have an issue with the model you're building. And sometimes that's okay if you're intending to, or the standard to be different, but the point of that feature is so that you are just aware of when the standard is, or when your model is not compliant with your code. So how do you fill this out? It's pretty straightforward, and especially for, I think that most or all of everyone's on here is a planner that probably works with the code often, if not on a daily basis for your city. But just to kind of show you the process we would go through and just some little tips on how to do it best. So I'm going to open up here. I chose to take a look at Green River, Wyoming. Is anybody from Green River on the call? No? Okay, we can pick on them, I guess. So selected somewhat randomly. We've done projects in Lander and Laramie and Lovell. So I thought I'd just pick a new one to crack open, and it's always fun to just kind of see how zoning codes vary. And so picked Green River. And so I've opened up their code here. They have it in this Muni code tool, which makes it pretty easy to navigate around, which is helpful. And so we're going to start with the R3 district. So I chose that after taking a look at the purpose statement here, and then also taking a look at their zoning. So I pulled up their zoning map on the county's GIS site. And just kind of started to get familiar with the town and kind of where maybe some infill development might be appropriate and what their zoning looks like. And so picked R3 because it's kind of in the middle between a single family and their multifamily zones. And so it's probably a good place to start if they're thinking about kind of infill of missing middle housing. And that was a lot of our focus in the Code Audit Guidebook. Of course, they could pick to focus on their single family residential, R1 district, or the R4 district, or the commercial district. This tool can kind of be tailored to any kind of code audit process. It doesn't always need to be a middle housing type, but that's what I decided to focus on for this. So first, to start filling out that zoning matrix, you want to just go through and just see. So let's take these pieces out that these are not from Green River's code. They're just pre-filled standards, and I'll just kind of fill in a few just to kind of show you how we would go through that process. So, get into the code, and so here's my height and bulk requirements. In R3, it's 6,000 square feet is the minimum lot size, so I'll start to fill that out. Minimum lot area per dwelling unit. This one's important, and so it's 3,000 square feet per unit. And so that is where I would go down into my density standard here. Let me delete this because this isn't accurate. And so this is where you have to do a little bit of conversion. So the tool presents everything in units per acre, but a lot of codes are structured so that they regulate density as square feet required, minimum number of square feet required per unit. And so what I would do with this is just convert that into a units per acre for our purposes here. So take an acre, 42,560 square feet, divided by 3,000. So that, if you convert 3,000 square feet per unit to units per acre, is about 15 units per acre. So that's a way to kind of capture that. So the minimum lot size is still 6,000 square feet, but then if you have anything that's a multi-unit project, you need to have 3,000 square feet per unit. So we would go through and capture all these standards in this table, and so always your starting place for this process is to fill out the matrix, and then to give you a sense of what that looks like when it's completely filled out. So
this process of filling out a matrix can be a great thing to do with a team too. If you're pulling together a couple folks to help you with this, which I would highly recommend. Maybe it's someone from your plan commission, someone who's on town staff, maybe another volunteer. Having a few people who have varying levels of familiarity with your code is helpful, because we've seen this happen in a few communities where they start filling out this matrix and there's disagreements and people read the code differently. And so getting clear on what your code says and doesn't say can be helpful. And sometimes it takes a few sets of eyes to get it right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I brought up in the Code 101 class as well, is that you can fill this out and then also add columns for each one of your zones, and kind of have a single spreadsheet where you have all of your zones on there, and that can just be really helpful because sometimes you haven't actually done that and compared how your standards vary across zones and whether there's some inconsistencies that don't make sense. So it can just be a useful exercise. So this is the filled out version of the matrix for the R3 zone for Green River. And so one thing I wanted to note about this is that I ran into that is a good example of how you need to kind of adjust this this tool to fit your code in some places. So you'll see that in the template, lot coverage is typically done at, if there's a lot coverage standard, it's typically captured as a percentage of the lot. So usually maybe it's something like 40 or 50%. So it's set up to be handled as a percentage. As I dug into the Green River code, they don't have a maximum lot coverage standard, but they do have a minimum open space standard, which in the lower density zones is based on a percentage of the lot. In the R3 zone, it's based on the number of units. So it's a square footage per unit standard. So it's 1,500 feet per unit. And so we'll just have to kind of adjust the tool to work for that. So what I did was just wrote this and captured this as 1,500 square feet per unit. So what that means is that when we get to the process of doing the building envelope test, then we'll have to kind of adjust for that, and I'll show how we've done that. But it just kind of, every code has a little idiosyncrasies like that, and they're not all going to use these same terms or measure things in the same way. So you kind of have to use your judgment and make adjustments to it to make it work. I'd also point out that in terms of lot coverage, there's two different measures here. There's impervious surface limit, and so for the purpose of this tool, that is what that refers to is the portion of the lot that's covered by either a building or a parking lot. And so it doesn't capture like hardscape patios or anything like that. It's just kind of just keeping it at a simpler level. But if you have anything about impervious surface, or if the maximum lot coverage in your code is defined as any impervious surface area, then you'll want to use this that standard rather than the maximum building lot coverage, which is the percentage of the building footprint, the maximum building footprint is percentage of the lot. So we filled out the zoning matrix. We have all the information that we need. And so let me skip back to the step-by-step and give you a sense for where we're at. So the step-by-step includes some more detailed information here on how to fill out the matrix and some tips. Again, if you're a planner, this is probably, and you're working on your own code, it's probably pretty straightforward, but we also gave some tips of where to look for additional standards. Like sometimes there are special use regulations, there are design standards which might affect this, landscaping standards maybe, so we need to keep those in mind as well. Okay, so we're filling it out. And so now let's go back to our tool. And our first step now is let's just get familiar with these other tabs and what they look like. And so the first one here is the building envelope tab. And what this is basically all the physical and dimensional inputs to your model. And so it has, well, first up here, there's the option for putting in some information about that specific project you're working on, so you can kind of track. And so for this one, I might just fill it in and say R3 existing. And we're first going to test a building on the min lot size, so I'll put that in there. And this is for Green River. And so site characteristics are your minimum lot width and depth, and it automatically then calculates the area. And so here's actually where I should also mention the cells in here. Anything that is gray is a cell that is intended to be an input. So those are the cells you should edit. But anything that's white is an output, and so those are not meant to be edited. So you can check, and you can see here, this is referencing a formula or a cell in a whole nother tab, and there's a whole series of hidden tabs here where there's some calculators then that are feeding into this sheet. And so really just make sure you're only changing the gray cells. And the cells that are red are where it's pointing out, like I mentioned, that your standard is exceeding or is not compliant with what you've said is the zoning standard in the research matrix tab. And so, for example, here, this shows our lot width, which on this pre-filled was at 50 feet, but the minimum lot width of the zone is 60 feet, and so it's marking that as red. And so let's just go ahead and update that to 60 feet. And so that gets us to being in compliance with the minimum lot width. And we know that the minimum lot size is 6,000, so we really only need 60 by 100 lot to fit the minimum lot size. Our setback is not high enough here as well for the front, so we'll go ahead and change that, and so set that to 20 feet. So here I'm starting to show you the process of building a model of what's allowed under your existing code. And so why don't we just keep on going through that process, because that's a good way to kind of get familiar with each of these sections of the code audit tool. And so we have to first kind of make some assumptions about what kind of building we want to build, and what kind of what we want to test here. And so if we're assuming, okay, R3 lot, and let's test what for example, what size lot and what would be required in order to build an 8-plex, right? So it's an 8-unit apartment building, and let's just use that as an example to test that out. So what we need to do is, even though our minimum lot size here is in compliance with the zoning, we know with the minimum lot size, we know it's not in compliance with the maximum density, because you need to have 3,000 square feet for every unit. And so I just kind of do a little math, and your calculator or off to the side here is, you can do a little scratch pad. So I know I need 3,000 square feet per unit, and I'm going to build an 8-unit building, and so I need 24,000 square feet. And so in order to, you can't edit the size of the lot, the area of the lot directly, and so we would go ahead and just edit the lot dimensions in order to get to that. And that's important because the lot dimensions also feed into the calculator of your overall site layout and the stats that are shown up here. And so we need a 24,000 square foot lot. So if we assume, I think from what taking a look at a few of the lots in Green River, a common lot depth is 125 feet. So we'll just keep that as a constant. And then if the lot depth is 125 feet, so then what does the width need to be? So it's 192 feet. So we can then edit that. And so then this automatically adjusts to show you have a 24,000 square foot lot is what you need in order to build an 8-plex. So roughly, about half an acre, a little more than half an acre needed. And so while we're here, why don't we just pause and look at this top section here. So this is kind of your dashboard for what your building model is looking like. And so this will adjust every time you change any of these inputs below. And so units on site is the number of units per acre is the density, and then these are some of the financials, which we'll come back to in a moment. It also can calculate the number of jobs on site and jobs per acre if you have retail or office or any kind of non-residential use. And that's just based on some job multipliers or job density numbers that are built into the tool. Gives you the gross square footage of the building, the floor area ratio, so the square footage divided by the site size. And so this is kind of your dashboard you want to keep in mind and kind of be continually looking at as you're adjusting these inputs below. And so then this section over here gives you kind of a diagram of how the kind of space on your site is used. And so it's not intended to be kind of a layout of the actual where the building is versus the setback area versus the landscaping. It doesn't quite get to that level of kind of doing a design for your site. But it gives you a sense of how the space is distributed, right? So right now, 36% of the site would be the building, 36% would be in the setback area, 20% would be in the parking, and then an additional 8% would be some additional landscaped area. Okay, so let's keep going. We're building our existing, modeling for our existing code. Where could we put an 8-plex, and what would an 8-plex look like? So right now we're up to 8 units, so we're meeting our goal for the number of units we were looking to get to. We actually have a little bit more. And so because we have a few more units than, we have 8.1, you want to try to get this to a round number, because obviously there is no 0.1 or 10% of a unit. And so we try to get that down to a round number for it to kind of make sense and be a more accurate model. And so a few things you might start to change here. So it looks like we have a bit of additional landscaped area here. And so the challenge is, though, we know that we need a minimum amount of open space on the site to meet that requirement of 1,500 square feet per unit. And so because this tool doesn't exactly automatically calculate the amount of open space and whether it's compliant with that, I'm just going to build in a little calculator here. And so I know that it's 1,500 square feet per unit. So I'm going to reference that unit, number of units cell, and do times 1,500. So I know that I need about 12,000 square feet of open space on the site. And then what I'm going to do here, and this is kind of like maybe like a 301 trick here, but just kind of as a way of illustrating the types of adjustments you might need to make for the tool to make it work for you. I'm going to take do a formula here to get the actual open space provided on the site. And then I'll be able to tell then whether or not I'm in compliance with the open space standard. And so it looks like I'm actually not. So the minimum amount of open space that's required on the site is 12,000 square feet. The actual open space is 10,378. And so this is what these slider bars here are for, is you start to adjust it to get it in compliance with your zoning. And so I'm going to go ahead and add to that. So you can see, you can just kind of click the arrows here to add more landscaping on the site. And it adjusts, and so it actually reduced the number of units. And now I have too much, and so I'm going to bring it down a little bit and try to get to the points where I can get to 8 units there and still meet the open space. So I'm pretty close there. So then I'll think, okay, what else can I do to get a few more units on this? And so let's go down here and look at a few of these other pieces. So one, we're at a 1-story building right now, and so let's adjust the building height. And so we're going to go ahead and bring it up to 2 stories. And I think 2 stories is all we'll need for sure. There we have 11 units on the site. I also could adjust the mix of different bedroom or unit sizes here. And so these are all inputs you can change to edit the mix of residential units. So you can see here it has the unit size and the percentage of units in the building. So you can manipulate those to get to a unit count that you're trying to get to, or to just test out the effect of different kinds of unit mixes. Building uses. So here I'll go ahead and keep this at, right now we're at multifamily renter. That's the product type we're going to test. There's other options here, and there's some details in the step-by-step for how each of those work. And then the renter or owner feeds into the financials tab. So when we get back to that, this feeds into their pro forma, which tells you whether or not you're measuring your profitability based on how a rental product would be measured versus an ownership for sale product. So now we're getting into parking type, and so what this is there are 3 different kinds of parking that are assumed on the site for the purposes of this. And for most kind of smaller communities, you're going to assume it's surface parking. And so if you keep this at a level of 1 and how it's set now, it'll assume it's surface parking. If you increase it, it'll assume it's structured parking, so it'd be parking that's built into the first level of the building, and upper levels are either retail or office or apartments. So for our purposes, we're going to keep it at surface parking. Tuck under underground or structured parking is very expensive, and it only happens in some larger urban areas. Now we're going to get into parking requirements. So you can see here that my residential parking requirement is set at 1.5 spaces per unit. So it's providing 16 spaces on the site total. And so it's red though, because our parking requirement is 2 spaces per unit from the city's code. And so let's go back and edit that then. We know we need to have 2 spaces per unit. Okay, now we're pretty close. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip forward. I already kind of played with this to get to that building type I was looking to get to, which is an 8-plex. And so I'll go ahead and show you that. That's in this next sheet here. And so I made some other adjustments to get that to work. So this is now my kind of completed model of if the developer wanted to build an 8-plex in Green River in the R3 zone, this is something like what that would look like. And so let's look in the financials tab for this one and get a sense for how the tool also handles financial feasibility. So there are a few different sections in here. First, there's costs, and there's hard costs, soft costs, and then there's a summary here. You can see a lot of these automatically calculate based on other inputs. So there's really only a few cost inputs you need to provide in order to tailor this tool. And so first is a construction cost. And so right now it's estimated at $115 per square foot for residential. This is understanding what your construction costs are in your city. It can be somewhat tricky and it can vary a lot. But we typically interview a few local builders, people in the construction industry, developers, to get a sense for what's a good estimate for your construction costs. And so we've, I think, preset this tool at 115 for residential. I think it's probably somewhat accurate for a lot of smaller communities. It's something you can modify though if you work with some developers, and it's actually more or less than that. And then for land, we've assumed $4 per square foot here, but so the land input, this is for the entire site. And so I've assumed $100,000 here for this about half-acre site. And one way to get a quick sense of what land costs might be is to actually look at tax lot files. And so if you go into your county's assessor data, and you can look in and say, okay, let's find a lot that's like maybe somewhat similar sized. This one's pretty big, but it's it might be close, and so we can go and look at what is it didn't work. Retail. Not coming up for that one, but so you can get a sense for what the assessed market value is of the property that's done by the county tax assessor, and that can give you a sense for what the land cost might be. That can vary a lot. So we typically do some outreach to developers to understand what land costs are typically, but for our purposes, we've inputted $100,000 for that site. Impact fees. So these are things like if you have any connection fees or system development charges, things like that. It's preset at 1% of the total hard costs of the site. So hard costs is all your construction costs. Other soft costs are things like developer fees, taxes during construction, contingencies for construction. There's a whole bunch of different things that feed into that, but it's typically about 15% of hard costs. So that's the base assumption there.
As Jamin was mentioning earlier, sorry, I'll hop in here real quick.
Yeah, sure.
A great way to get all these numbers, we're big fans of doing, as Jamin was saying, interviewing a handful of developers. Find, 5 or 6 people who have built something in your town in the last 10 years, or have attempted, better yet, someone who's attempted to but hasn't been able to build something. They'll be pretty familiar with what a lot of these numbers are. And again, sometimes you'll find discrepancies there. Sometimes, someone from town will say, oh, our fees are low. It's probably, 1% of project cost. And then a developer might say, actually, there's different ways the fees are interpreted, and this is how it impacted my project, and it ended up being 5% of my project cost. So going through and interviewing a few folks also just gives you a lot of good, qualitative feedback too. So pulling in a few developers and just, working through this worksheet with them, and maybe a couple folks from your team, could be a great process to go through to learn about barriers to housing and just in its own right, even if you're not doing a full audit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And then taxes, another thing that you can also use your tax assessor files to get a sense for. And so, for now, we've estimated it at 1% here, so about $5,500 per year. So this is annual property taxes, and so the tool assumes that the tax costs go up over time as the property appreciates, and so there's some assumptions built in. So you really just need to try to estimate what the first year taxes would be. And then revenue. So this section captures what the typical rental rates would be, or what you should assume your rental rates would be. And so for Green River, I pulled up Zillow and I kind of looked around a little bit. I read some rental listings and just kind of seen there's not too many, but there's a few that are available. So these are existing buildings, which are going to be a little bit less expensive than a new building. But I got a sense for what rents look like. And then I just input a few estimates into the tool. And so, $950 for a 2-bedroom down to $600 for a studio. You can always change these later as you get more information. But that's, a really important input to this whole tool. So if we were modeling a for sale product, we would put in here residential sales revenue. So if you're modeling townhomes, they're going to be sold, then you would use this to kind of input what the typical market price for a new product might be. And then you can also, if you have a commercial development you're modeling, you can input the retail or office rents in this section here. And so what we've started here is pre-filled some somewhat typical prices for kind of smaller towns in Wyoming, or smaller towns in the West, I'd say more generally. But like Bud mentioned, doing some interviews, collecting some more information to tailor this more would always be good to get it more accurate. All right, so that's the financials tab. So basically, the financials tab shouldn't change too much as you test the impact of code changes. So a lot of those things don't really vary by the kind of product you're putting together, except for potentially your land costs. And so we'll come back to that and show you need to adjust that to account for different sizes of sites. Okay, so back to the building envelope, and so now we've completed the model of, this is an existing code. It's an 8-plex that's built to comply with the existing code, and let's just kind of evaluate it. So these two metrics up here in terms of financial feasibility are the most important when you're looking at a rental product. So internal rate of return and cash on cash return. And I wish Alex was on board or on the call, because he could help you explain the difference between the two of those quite a bit better than I can. But for our purposes, we typically look at, an internal rate of return, something in the realm of 12% is kind of a good marker for. Anything above that is going to be pretty attractive for a developer to build, and they're going to be interested in that. And as you start to get anything lower than that, it's just become a little less attractive. And then on cash, we typically use a target of 10%. And this is another good thing to talk to developers about locally. So as you do some interviews, with them, ask them what their profitability expectations are and what they typically expect to get on kind of return they expect in order to make that investment. And you can kind of modify your expectations here. Okay, so once we kind of feel like this model is complete and we have filled everything out to our satisfaction, then it's a good idea to kind of take a step back and start to document this. And so I typically have a separate sheet where I'm just putting together, this is a little finicky on me. Let's see what's going on. There we go. So it's good to kind of start with a template like this, so you can help track as you're changing different things in the pro forma and testing the impacted code changes. And so we start here with our minimum lot size, 8plex, and then I'm going to show you looking at an infill lot. And then we're going to look at what if we made some changes, like increasing the density, reducing the open space, reducing the amount of parking that's required. We'll kind of fill that out as we go. And so here's the version that's filled out. So I'll go to hide these now if we don't want to do give away the ending there. And so good to document this all in one place, and then you can start to compare against some changes you made. And so, you know, like I said, we always try to look at it from the perspective of an infill project. And so let's go ahead and model kind of what could be built on a typical existing infill lot. And then we'll make some changes from there. And so I'll start with this. This is the minimum, the model that's built to the minimum lot size that we just showed. And so let's go through and say, okay, well, instead of assuming that we have a building, an 8plex that we're looking to find a site for, let's assume we have a site and we're just trying to figure out what we can build on that site. And so there's two different kind of ways to approach it. So if we assume we already have a site, well, the question is then, okay, well, what size site should we assume? And so what we would typically do is look at what is a typical standard infill lot in your community. This is again where the tax assessor or your GIS data becomes really helpful. I mean, this is something as a planner you probably already know. You know, in some of your various areas of town have pretty consistent, you know, lot platting. But you might do a little bit of analysis to figure out, okay, what's a typical lot? What are a lot of our vacant lots that are potential infill lots? What are those sized at? You might want to build like a prototype of something that could be repeated on multiple lots throughout town. And so for Green River, I kind of just took a look at this R3 zone and some of these areas that are close to the downtown, and saw there's a pretty clear kind of historic platting of 50 by 125 lots. So I just kind of went in here and did some measurements of, okay, yeah, they're about 125, and we know they're about 50 feet wide. And so this is something that you can also do in Google Earth or Google Maps, but I think a lot of you will have access to that through your county tax lot files. And so, okay, let's assume it's a 50 by 125 lot then. So 7,500 square feet as it should be, or 6,250. Hold on a second. I might have assumed. Oh, let's assume 60 by 125. I think that's 7,500, right? I think when I did some other measurements, it was about 60 feet. So there's our standard infill lot. And so let's just change the to allow more density on this lot than would otherwise be allowed, and see how that affects our pro forma. So right now it's assuming there's 2 units on the site, and I think that would be consistent with a minimum, or the maximum density. So we know that from our zone matrix that the standard is 3,000 square feet per unit. And so on a 7,500 square foot lot, we would be limited to 2 units at 6,000 square feet. So then if we assume then that we can build more than that, so let's test if we doubled the density, then what we can then do is, all right, well, one thing we could do is change it. Instead of having 2 bedroom and 1 bedroom units, let's just have all studios and see if we can fit more units because we have smaller units on the site. So if we had all studios, it increases it slightly. But you also might notice that we have a little bit more open space than what is required. So let's kind of tamp that down a little bit and see if we can get up to 3 or 4 units. So it's kind of an iterative process here where you're kind of playing with the different inputs to try to get to a result. So here's pretty close. So we've got up to 3 units, so you can see our units per acre is red here because that's over the density. 3 stories, that's about right. Looks like everything else is pretty close here, but the rate of return is off. So that seems weird, but it would be lower than what was for on the existing site. And so let's skip back over here, and if you can see, the land cost is actually still $100,000, and so that's based on the half-acre site. And so we know this is a much smaller site, and so I did a little research looking at what a vacant lot is in this zone about that size, and it's about 20,000. So we can bring that down, and you can see how that really bumps up the return rates. There's lowering the land costs. So I did a little bit of, again, playing around with that, and then got to what would be kind of your typical, first, here's your kind of typical infill lot if you're compliant with the zoning. Kind of skipped over that part. So this model shows that. So if you only have 2 units, you have, basically you have a duplex on this 7,500 square foot lot. This is the rate of return you could expect. And then the next one is that test that we just started to build there, which is increasing the density to allow higher density on that same size lot. And so we got up to 3 units, and our rate of return also went up there. So we're getting closer to what kind of a target is for a feasible project. So I think that's a good sign, but we're still not quite there. And so we might look at some other changes we could make to increase feasibility. And so on all the kind of way through here, I'm capturing what those, why keeps doing this, capturing each of those changes to show the impact of each change. And so here's my infill lot that is compliant with the existing code. Here is the infill lot where we allowed the density to increase a little bit. So we didn't change any of the minimum open space, the setback standards, the parking standards. We just allowed more units. And so you can see that our units per acre went up to 17. We have now a triplex and a little bit more profitable than your duplex on the existing lot. So let's go ahead and reduce the open space and standards and see what that does to our pro forma. So I'm going to open up this model. This is one I've already built here. And sorry for all the bouncing around. For some reason, it won't let me switch between sheets very easily here. Right, okay, so the change here we made is to reduce the setbacks and the minimum open space requirement. And so you can start to capture these in this first zone matrix tab. So you want to keep these existing standards column the same, but then you can start to tweak these to then show what you're testing in this specific spreadsheet. And so We are testing here, reducing the front setback from 20 to 15 feet, reducing the side setback from potentially 7.5 feet to 5 feet, and the rear setback to from 15 to 10 feet. And then we're also testing, if we were to change this minimum open space requirement from 1,500 square feet per unit to 750 square feet per unit. So that's the way you kind of capture that. And then as we look, oh, just 1 second. I'm on a call. Okay, that's fine. So let's see, where were we? We're at now at increasing the density and reducing the open space. So I've reduced the setbacks, and I've reduced the minimum open space requirement to let's see, 500 square feet per unit is actually what we did here. And so you can see we can get 5 units on the site. Our return jumped up a little bit. We definitely have a higher density level. So we're starting to get closer to something that might be kind of profitable and attractive to build. So go ahead and capture that here. And then let's do one more, we'll show you one more test. So if we were to then reduce the parking requirements additionally and see what that does. And so again, we're layering on each of these tests. So we reduced the setbacks already, we reduced the open space. So we're down to the bottom here. And so let's drop this from, it was 2 spaces per unit and down to 1 space per unit. So let's just show you what that looks like. So if we were to have 2 spaces per unit, that's what the project would look like. And you drop down to 1, and the tool automatically assumes if you have to provide less parking, then you can have a larger building, and it increases the building footprint and the number of units. And so we got up to 6 units. So basically we're at a 6-plex now on this 7,500 square foot lot. And so then I went ahead and captured that in our kind of tracking sheet here. And you can see that we're getting a lot closer to those profitability targets we had. So 12% at the internal rate of return and 10% on the cash on cash return. And so if you kind of take a step back here, this is a good point where you could say, okay, we've made a lot of changes to the code, and we've definitely improved financial feasibility for infill development. And so this might be a good time to kind of share out your results and think about a community process to start to propose these code changes. So what would it look like to increase density in this zone, reduce parking, make some of these changes? Just something we can get the community to support those changes. I think, as we mentioned in the 101 session, is you might need to pair that with maybe there's some new design standards that go in place. So you might trade and say, okay, well, we'll allow higher density and less parking, but we'll introduce some new design standards to kind of make sure that that infill development, is compatible with the neighborhood. And so this is a kind of just a good starting place and a good place for you to kind of be able to show and make the case for the impacts to feasibility and also potential affordability. So the last thing I wanted to cover is that you can, another way to present this data is to kind of hold the return rate constant, but then to adjust the rents to show what rents would need to be in order for the project to be feasible. So let me show you what that would look like quickly. So here's our existing code on the infill lot. And so return rate is below what the target is. And so we could then go into our rent assumptions. So these rent assumptions are based on what the market can bear, what do we think the market is there. So let's go ahead and increase that to, I don't know, maybe it's 1,500 for a 2-bedroom. Oh yeah, we're definitely getting more feasible there. So maybe it only needs to be 1,200. So you can toy with the tool to get to the place where, okay, this is what it would need to be for that project to be feasible. And then when you do your comparison, you can show that in the you could add a line here for rental rate and compare under the existing lot. Let's say the average was, I think, something like $1,250. And then with these changes, the same project would be viable with rents only at $950. And the math really, it would start to make sense. Is that, well, you have 2 units on this, you have a duplex on a 7,500 square foot lot versus a triplex on 7,500 square foot lot. So lower rents per unit, the lower rents per unit are offset by having more units. So this is just another way to frame this as what you're making smaller units and more units feasible versus kind of larger and fewer units and more expensive units by allowing that higher density. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I think we have 15 minutes left or so, and let's open it up for some questions.
Any questions, anybody?
You can feel free just to unmute yourself and hop in and ask questions if you have any.
Yeah, we're not a big group.
Hey, Jamin, this is Derek Taney at the City of Laramie. I just, I think some of us are a little more familiar with the toolkit. And what I was going to say is could you give us just some, what you would, you mentioned it really early on in the presentation, and why I'm asking again, just for the group, is what do you think is the best way just to start out with kicking off using this toolkit with whether it's elected officials or the public or that like working group you were talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think starting off with the existing code analysis is probably a good way to do it. So that's what we typically do, is just kind of say what would rents need to be in order for that project to be feasible under your existing code. And that usually is pretty compelling for people to see, is like, oh, well, that's why that product type or the housing type is not being built, is because the rents would need to be, $1,500, $2,000 per unit in order for that to be feasible. And that's just not, given local incomes in the market, that's, it's not going to be built. And so kind of, I think a good place to start is I think getting everyone on the same page that there is a problem here, and there is that under your existing code, you just can't build something that is feasible to provide to the market. And then from there, you can start to think about, okay, what kinds of changes would be potentially supportable by the community, right? Maybe we'd be okay with, and that's where it gets to that kind of housing types discussion, right? Okay, maybe we'd be okay with some more townhomes or small apartment buildings in our single family zones. Maybe we'd be okay reducing parking. Maybe this open space standard is a little too onerous, and is that really that important to us? And you can start to get a sense for what kinds of changes people might be open to. And then you can go through a process like this, where you actually then test out the impacts of each of those. But yeah, I think starting with the existing code is a good place.
I agree, Jamin, and I'll add to that too. As Jamin was saying earlier, this whole thing is kind of based around the premise of having a model housing type you're testing against. So man, our community really wants to see fourplexes in this area, or we're really into the idea of accessory dwelling units, but we're not getting any. Why? If you don't have that type, convene a small group, even if it's just 2 or 3 of you, fill out the zone matrix so you can get familiar with what is supposed to be allowed in each zone. Read through your local plans if you have any local plans. I don't know I know there's a lot of planners on this call, but there's probably a lot of people who aren't trained planners too, or aren't even that familiar with any of your local planning documents. But start reading through and get a sense of what is supposed to be allowed in different zones, and then go walk around some of those neighborhoods with your group and say, man, this zone was saying we're supposed to allow duplexes. I don't think I see one duplex here, or the duplexes I do see are, you know, from the 60s and 70s, and I haven't seen any new ones. And then if you're still kind of stuck on what should be allowed where, having that conversation with a couple builders or a couple developers earlier, say, man, what are some of the stuff that you've tried to build lately? Those guys will have a really good sense of, man, I tried to build a triplex a year ago, and here are the barriers that I hit. So if you're having a hard time figuring out what the scope of the thing that you're trying to test is, or what scope of audit you're trying to do, start by just having some of those conversations. Go through your zoning provisions, walk through some neighborhoods, and talk to some developers. It'll give you a pretty good kind of hit list of the things that you might want to figure out. This is what we want to allow here. What code provisions do we need to change? And then you can dive into using the tool. I'd also add that, you know, this tool is really, really useful for doing a pretty deep analysis. Feel free to use it as a deep tool or as a light tool. Sometimes it's helpful just to draw this stuff out on a piece of paper and say, just sketch out, this is our standard lot. We're going to remove our setbacks. We're going to remove our parking requirement. Holy cow, we don't have much left. Sometimes you could do some of this stuff on paper and use the tool kind of as a calculator on the side. Whatever works for you and your group. But sometimes getting scrappy on the back of an envelope, or, you know, the back of a cocktail napkin can actually help folks in your team understand what some of the problems are.
And one last thing to add is another way to approach it is kind of by like thinking about opportunity sites. So it's just kind of what we did in Laramie, is saying, you know, and so these are all kind of like more abstracted, right? It's like, okay, we have an infill lot. It's like a prototype, right? Like this thing could happen in multiple places. But what about if we just focus on one specific site and kind of use that as a test case, which then might also apply more broadly, but sometimes it's a little bit easier for your decision makers and community to kind of get their heads around, you know, one specific site and kind of visualizing what can happen there.
Any other questions?
I'll add too, if you are building up a team, look for someone who might have some GIS chops. If there's someone who, typically there's going to be a GIS technician or someone who does a little bit of GIS work, at least at the county, if you don't have one in your town. But having a GIS person on your team can really help. And because a lot of times you'll do a little bit of analysis and dive into your code and realize that minimum lot size seems kind of big, or that minimum lot width seems big, or that density standard seems weird. If you have a GIS person who can highlight, here's all of the lots that aren't buildable because of X, Y, and Z standards as you're going through with your team, that's really helpful for making the case to people who need to understand this information, whether that's, you know, folks on your plan commission or on city council or board of trustees or what have you, being able to show them a map and say, this specific provision is keeping us from building anything new on these 50 lots in town. That kind of stuff can be really helpful. So look for that GIS person to possibly put on your team. Cool. Any other questions?
You know, all of this can look pretty overwhelming at first. Like I said, it's technical, but As you get into it, one of the nice things about this is, I guess I'd encourage you just play around with it, the tool. And you might not have a specific use in mind yet, or you might not know how you're going to apply it, and what the planning process looks like that this will get plugged into. But it might just be helpful for you to kind of play around with it and just, imagine your own little fourplex you want to build somewhere in town, and see whether or not it'd be feasible. And I think the important, like the way to get to know this kind of analysis is to really just use it and give it a try, and you can start to understand how these different inputs affect the outputs, right? And just playing with the sliders, playing with the different assumptions, you can get a sense for kind of thinking like a developer about a site, and that, I think, getting into that mindset is then what allows you to figure out how to use this tool better. I think that the big picture idea is really just thinking like a developer.
All right. Well, if there's no other comments or questions, just want to wrap up here. Thanks to Jamin and Bud for presentation, and also thanks to community builders and Cascadia partners. So like we said before, the tool is available on the WYOPASS website. I sent the link around and send it around again when we do the email blast later. Let's see. So the session was recorded. It'll be available on the WYOPASS website in the end of this week or early next. Also, so this was I think available for 1.5 CM credits. That'll be up on their site, I think, before too long. The previous session that we did last month, it's up on APA's site, so you can log your credits there. It's also the recording, like I said, is available on the WYOPASS website. And then just so everyone knows, mark your calendars. March 17th, we have a panel discussion on the Pilot Hill project, which will also be 1.5 CM credits available. That's also going to be at noon, like this one. And with that, thanks everyone for coming, and again, thanks to our presenters.